Hello everybody, my name's Witter and I come from the Caribbean. I was born and raised in the parish of St Elizabeth in Jamaica and grew up with deaf parents. My father is a country sign user and my mother is bilingual in Jamaican Sign Language and Country Sign. I was educated in deaf schools in Jamaica as I grew up. And I've also been actively involved in advocating for the deaf community in Jamaica since 2012. So who are we? We are a group of people from Puerto Rico, Trinidad and Tobago and Jamaica who are actively involved in the Caribbean. Our goal is to try to provide solutions and accessible information and involve in community advocacy so that we better understand the needs of people within the Caribbean and so that we can work with other organisations to further the goals of deaf people's rights. We also include children and youth empowerment to try and change their life experiences. I have seen in the past that deaf children have lots of potential, but they don't know how they can capitalise on that. How they can share in leadership skills or advocate for themselves and be independently active in the community. Our goal is to support deaf children and young people to enable them to do that. We also are involved in the Government Youth Parliament historically. In 2018 I gave a presentation focusing on ICT, looking at how technology can be a powerful game changer for deaf people and the deaf community. In St Elizabeth Parish, we saw that deaf people were able to have much greater independence in their lives just by the use of simple technology, using familiar icons or familiar words, which meant that they could then involve in video chat or texting. But we can see even this simple intervention makes a massive change, and I was able to make that point in Parliament. Now in this presentation I want to look at the establishment of businesses by members of the deaf community, the experiences that I have, the Disability Act and how it supports the deaf community, and also deaf community life within the Caribbean. Across the Caribbean, deaf communities have very similar experiences and similar struggles. These include language rights and language deprivation, protecting our languages, the deaf economical engagement. Often we're not appropriately labelled as a culturally oppressed minority, and the education system doesn't provide us with adequate information, and we have a lower level of education. Often we're not allowed to use sign language, and we see that services discriminate against us as well. Society has a negative attitude towards deaf people. The legal system also doesn't match our needs. We can also see that services within the Caribbean often don't serve the needs or recognise the needs of deaf people. And deaf people struggle to receive appropriate education within different education systems, not just in Jamaica, Puerto Rico and Trinidad and Tobago, but in other Caribbean islands as well. We've noticed that there have been changes, and we hope those changes will continue to occur. The deaf community has been involved in advocacy and we've seen changes to date. People are more willing to listen to deaf people and try and support us in finding solutions. They want to know what our needs are, and they're wanting to make sure that they can provide resources which are appropriate and work in collaboration with the deaf community and other disability groups. We're also involved in youth campaigning, in the mainstream and other mainstream hearing advocacy groups which are involved in developing our nation. We do see that the cycle of experiencing communication barriers and access barriers is being broken, and there are changes occurring. Rise Life Management, funded by the EU, has been involved in activities to provide essential services in Jamaica and have worked with the Right to Sign to ensure that we have level 1, level 2 and now level 3 Jamaican Sign Language. That really means that people are starting to appreciate Jamaican Sign Language and appreciate deaf culture. And that means that we can start to have appropriate services for Jamaican deaf people. And we know the same applies with Trinidad and Tobago. There have been training in Trinidad and Tobago Sign Language for healthcare workers and other workers too. In Jamaica, we now see quite a lot of improvements, as we see in other countries across the Caribbean. The activities of the deaf communities are being recognised as part of nation building, and people have received awards from the Prime Minister in recognising the work that they've been involved in nation building. I was honoured to receive such an award, and it's great to try and encourage more people to get their work rewarded. One of the problems we see is that deaf people are very active in engaging in nation building, but the front people, whilst acknowledging them, receive all of the accolades and the attention. They'll thank deaf people, but they won't draw people's attention to their work. So they act as a barrier to deaf people's work being appreciated and recognised. And we need to change that. We need to make sure that deaf people are able to speak for themselves and they have greater recognition across our nations. That then will impact people's attitudes and thinking, because they'll start to think, oh wow, the deaf community and deaf people can do this work for themselves, whereas at the moment they're doubtful that deaf people have the capacity to do those things because they've never seen deaf people doing those things and they don't realise the amount of work that's gone on in the background by deaf people. The government has a variety of ways of participating with our community, engaging in participation. We have PLED funding from USAID, and the Honourable Floyd Green launched that project, and it was great to see that he had learnt his alphabet, so he was able to fingerspell his first name. That was very much appreciated, and we can see that there's lots of potential to make changes within our nation. That doesn't mean that there aren't challenges there. Often people don't know where to find information about the deaf community. We need to make sure that the information that's shared is accurate. Sometimes information that's shared isn't actually accurate and doesn't accurately reflect the deaf community. So it's great to see that this cabinet minister, the Honourable Floyd Green, was able to fingerspell his name. But it's clear that we need to make sure that we are more available to members of the community, the wider community, so they can learn our language, learn about our community, and learn about what we need to survive. Deaf communities across the Caribbean are very open and willing to engage with people. They have many skills. People have many skills that they can use to contribute towards the building of the community. Sadly, many people want to help communities, but we would much rather use the term that we work together so we can learn mutually from each other and support deaf communities across the Caribbean, and then you can learn about us. We have deaf community businesses established across the Caribbean, but often we see those businesses struggle to develop. Often a deaf business may be established and then somebody will steal the idea and then set up a rival business, and their business will do very well. Typically because as hearing people, they're more able to access wider information and make connections across the community, which means that deaf people are left knowing that their idea and work was wasted. So one example is sign language classes. We see hearing people are now starting to try and teach sign language. This is a really difficult challenge for us. Often we see that signs aren't taught well, the information about the community is not accurate, and so we have to work 3 times as hard to try and rectify the mistakes that are made. Sometimes that can be a hard battle. People will say, no, but I learnt that. I've got my certificate. And we often have to then rectify that, say, no, that's not accurate, that's not correct. And so across the Caribbean, we want to make sure that people are using the right signs. But I know that that's a challenge globally, but it is definitely a challenge that we are faced with too. We have many businesses in Jamaica. So we have deaf cafes where deaf people make coffee or make baked goods, baked products, perhaps clothes. There are well-known websites on clothes as well. The Right to Sign has training, sensitization workshops for Jamaican Sign Language and often provide interpreting services for the deaf community if they need interpreting in courts or in the police or whatever situation where interpreting or translation services are needed. We have a graphic designer who's very talented and is able to make flyers, advertisements and videos. And he makes them for big companies for many years, so we have that skill within the community as well. We also have people in the community who work with livestock, farms, and so have very good employment in that regards. We have other people who buy goods wholesale and then sell them as well. Some people have small businesses selling clothes, food, shoes, perhaps body products and hair products, and set up their own business. And we also have many deaf people who have good qualifications in being electricians, making furniture, in construction, cleaning, painting, general maintenance. So we have deaf people who are very talented doing many things, but it can be very hard for them to be involved in the wider mainstream activities. We see organisations who want to engage with deaf people in discussions. Often we see well-known organisations will have specific representatives who talk on behalf of the deaf community without letting deaf people speak for themselves. So they can actually talk about their own community and their own experiences. So people who are embedded in the community can actually talk in much greater depth about their details. Maybe it's a systemic issue. Maybe the problem is when they're wanting to have one person to represent the community, that becomes the problem. Maybe we need to say you need to use a term like a community member to come and share information. And getting rid of the term representative would perhaps change the way communities are engaged with, and that would be better. We have seen greater changes in society and better access for deaf people, better participation of deaf people in wider civil society, and that's great to see. In Trinidad and Tobago, in 1961, deaf people were able to drive and get a driving licence. Then a decision was made by the Prime Minister to stop deaf people being able to drive, and that decision held for 7 years. The deaf community engaged in complaint raising, advocacy, campaigning to get driving licences back, and then after 7 years, finally, they reneged on that decision and deaf people were able to drive again in Trinidad and Tobago. In Jamaica, we had similar struggles, although our struggle lasted for 32 years before we were able to gain our driving licences again, and that happened in 2009. So we can see that there are laws that provide access and a variety of things across the Caribbean to ensure that we're treated with equal respect. In Puerto Rico, they fall under the American ADA law, and so they have greater rights already. If we consider the quality of interpreting services in Jamaica, it's not unproblematic, although we have seen some improvements. Historically, we had very poor interpreting services. If we consider television interpreting, the interpreter was far too small on the screen. Often the background wasn't appropriate, or maybe the interpreter was half out of shot, so we couldn't see the full language. As time has moved on, we've seen greater improvements where we see a greater size of the share of the screen taken by the interpreter. And sometimes that can be as much as half of the screen, so we can see the interpreter much more clearly. Although there has been some improvements, we also see some areas where things are getting worse again, and we have to continue to be vigilant. The law at the moment doesn't detail the size of the screen and the background colour that's needed, for example. The JCPD has worked quite hard with the Disability Act. You may not be aware, but Jamaica was the first signatory to the UNCRPD in May 2007. And we've worked hard since then. Recently, in February 14th, 2022, we had a big celebration because that was the first time we were able to actually launch a Disability Act, finally. So how does the deaf community benefit from that Disability Act? It's a Pan-Disability Act which doesn't contain much details in many ways. It doesn't detail specific needs of different communities, so we're still working together to try and develop its implementation. And I can give you two examples of the Disability Act which benefit the deaf community. One, for example, is the recognition of JSL, Jamaican Sign Language. It's actually mentioned in the Act, even though we don't have official language recognition by the government yet. We still see that it is mentioned explicitly in the Act, so that's positive. Also, if we think about how deaf people and other disabled groups transition from education into work, so for work readiness, we can see improvements in that area too. In terms of employment opportunities, we see quite a lot of discrimination. The Disability Act allows people to challenge that discrimination. So we're starting to see action, and we're hoping that within 2 years, organisations or businesses will have improved their employment practices for disabled people. We also see support from government funding, and that has facilitated improvement via the Disability Act. One of the biggest impacts is in interpreting. In 2020, due to COVID, we saw a big change across the Caribbean. Many Caribbean countries realised that they had to ensure that there was interpreting services, obviously because it was a health pandemic, a global health pandemic, and they wanted to make sure that that information was accessible to everybody. Prior to that point, if there were any emergencies, earthquakes, floods, hurricanes, there were no interpreters available for those emergency announcements. During the COVID era, we saw presentations with interpreters, although now, post-COVID, we're starting to see less presence of interpreters on the screen. People are not using interpreters as much, and often that's because if it's a last-minute request or an emergency, people feel that it's not necessary for deaf people to have access, especially if the interpreter isn't large enough. If deaf people can't see the interpreter, what's the point? And that means that deaf people tend to have access via newspapers or asking their neighbours. Also, we tend to make community media ourselves, so we make deaf-led news so that we can then post that on Facebook or social media so that deaf people know what's going on. That means that deaf people understand what's happening, albeit later, within our countries. Some people will have interpreters at work. Sometimes that's voluntary and there's no pay for the interpreters. In Puerto Rico, Trinidad and Tobago, we also have DRI, deaf relay interpreters, where you have a deaf relay interpreting directly to the deaf person. The hearing interpreter is often paid more than the deaf relay interpreter. And sometimes if there's a problem with the budgets, the DRI is removed, so it's only a hearing interpreter that's employed. The problem now is that the community is saying that they don't understand those hearing interpreters and they want the DRIs because those people are able to use the language much more fluently, embedded in the community, they use it in a much clearer way. And so we're hoping to see that we can have more DRIs in employment, both on TV, news, public announcements, emergency announcements, etc. In terms of NGOs, we have many different organisations that are established. One of the problems with those NGOs is often They don't have a physical location. A deaf person might establish the name of an organisation, run meetings, have discussions, maybe to do with sports or sports clubs. Maybe something which is run online to have discussions, to think about how we can improve deaf life. We also have hearing organisations that also want to support deaf life. Often they have a physical office location. So one of the things we need to do is make sure that organisations recognise that whether the organisation has a physical presence or not, it still exists and is there to support them. We have a number of foundations that support us: the Digital Foundation, the JPS Foundation, the NCB Foundation, also the CB Facey Foundation, several other foundations. They're able to offer a lot of support to our communities. Many organisations want to help the deaf community, but often their activities may not be well considered. They might want to buy things for the community, and we're often like, oh no, sorry, we don't need that. That doesn't really suit the needs of deaf people. One example would be the use of tablets in deaf education. Really, we need laptops rather than tablets in deaf education, but that's not what's being provided, and obviously laptops would be better for us. We also have NGOs and larger companies which are involved in mobilisation and sensitisation of the deaf people's context and deaf communities, and are able to support us with lots of resources and expose us to education, also change the attitudes of wider society. So we're very grateful for all of their work. We have a project teaching Jamaican Sign Language, JSL. JSL tends to be taught in classroom education, in church, and more widely in public. Country Sign tends to only be used by people who live within the parish of St Elizabeth and its surrounds, but there are no resources for the teaching of country signs. We don't have any interpreters across Jamaica who use country signs. We don't see country sign being used on television. And there aren't the resources to teach people country signs, as I've said. The UNDP has funded a project to do with relay interpreting within the police, to have a 6-month pilot. The project was highly effective to see how the quality of communication could improve when we have DRIs involved in situations. The ability for deaf people to be involved in leadership is very clear. We can see that deaf people are able to work with organisations and find solutions. Within the police group, we also saw that they are much more aware of the deaf community. In the past, they didn't really understand the deaf community and sign language using. That 6-month project really helped to open their eyes and their minds to understanding how to listen to deaf people appropriately, what deaf culture is, and so we can see that that's very much appreciated, the improvement in services that we see. And here we have a quote. If you want to be a true advocate, then you need to make sure no one is left behind. You must be inclusive. And why is this important? Because often we see publicity or advocacy for disabled people and disabled people's groups, but we have experienced that there are no interpreters at those events or involved in that activity, or if it's media, the interpreter's too small to be usable and there are no captions or videos. So if there's no captions and the video isn't present or is too small, then that means we don't have access to what's being said. We don't understand what's happening. So we need to think about diversity within different educational levels and what access means, and access to information. If you want to be a true advocate, we need to be inclusive. Caribbean deaf people want to be creative, to set up businesses, to be involved in advocacy and set up their own organisations. But we still experience discrimination of people thinking that we're not able to do those things. So we're often stuck within our societies and not free to express and mobilise as we'd like to. We experience so many barriers. Often at those moments we ask for help and support, but there aren't that many organisations or people who are willing to offer the support that we need at those moments, so that we can actually develop our communities. And I would beg you, please support deaf communities, help them with the needs that they request, so that we can grow. We'd like to encourage people to be more involved with deaf communities, and also invite us to give presentations across Jamaica, and also let us be involved in your special training or your professional development or personal development. Help us. That would help us a lot. Help us with your time. We want to learn more so that we can learn more about our nation, and that our nation can know more about us. In Jamaica, Puerto Rico and Trinidad and Tobago, we feel that there's still lots to do. We still have to work through many things, and we need support from other organisations. And the best thing for us to do is to ensure that all the Caribbean nations work together so we can find out which are the best strategies to give the best solutions. Thank you very much.